Just a couple notes of logistics before we introduce the panel. First, I just want to thank all of the attendees for coming today. I know we've lost some of them toward the end of the day. But it's been fantastic having people from all across the sectors, all across Virginia, here to talk with some national leaders. We'd like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to share some of their expertise about structuring pay for success and social impact bonds so far. We'd also like to thank our co-hosts, including the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, Third Sector Capital Partners, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and the TomTom Founders Festival. We also want to just remind you, if you want to continue networking, building partnerships, you can do so over at the TomTom Innovation Block Party. Social Entrepreneurship at UVA will have a tent, and there'll be an opportunity to continue some of these conversations there while having some local food, beer, and listening to some music. I'd also like to thank Josh Ogburn, whose vision and commitment to bringing this event together has been inspirational and incredibly impressive. Let's give him a round of applause. I'd like to also thank Lara Jacobson and Retzi, who's, I think, moved on to set up our next location, but they've done a phenomenal job, as well as all of the volunteers. We'd like to thank Lisa Downing and all the others at Newcomb that helped reserve the spaces and make this day possible. One last plug, we have just launched, Social Entrepreneurship at UVA has launched the Research Hub for Collaborative Innovation. And within that, there's a number of labs working in Charlottesville, working in Virginia, working nationally. And we will have a Pay for Success lab. So if your organizations are thinking about moving in this direction and you'd like some research support, we'll have a number of students helping organizations exploring Pay for Success opportunities. And then finally, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator for this panel, Nima Krodel. And all of the bios are in the brochures, but I'll turn it over to Nima. Should we maybe get started? We will have an additional panel member as we speak.
That's okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Nima Krodel from Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I am joined by Nirav Shah from Social Finance and Ellen Ward at Living Cities and Michael from Third Sector Capital Partners, who will be walking in any moment now. I know it's the end of the day, so we may tap dance in the middle of this to keep everyone's energy level up, but thanks for sticking with us as we talk about the topic of launching a Pay for Success transaction. Obviously, we've talked a lot in the morning about what goes into the earlier stages of building Pay for Success, from data to feasibility. And today we're really this session is really focused on what comes next, what comes after you've done some level of feasibility. What does it really take to get to launch, and obviously beyond? I want to tell you a little bit about Nonprofit Finance Fund, just so you know who we all are. NFF is a national nonprofit organization. The mission of our organization is to provide tailored investments, strategic advice, and tailored and accessible insights to the mission-driven sector. So what does that mean we do? We make loans to the nonprofit sector. We provide advisory and consulting support to mission-driven organizations and their funders, and then we all aim to lift all of that up to the field through our blogs and our writings and things. When Pay for Success came onto the scene, if you will, in around 5-ish years ago, we really saw the opportunity for our clients, those mission-driven organizations that are working with communities in need every day, to link the money piece of what they do to the mission piece of what they do. So if you take my business card, it actually says linking money to mission, and that's where we saw the opportunity of Pay for Success. At the same time, we recognize that it's Pay for Success and all of the elements that are around the transformation required to become much more outcomes driven is not an easy proposition, and really means a lot for all of the stakeholders at the table. And so we take a very strong learning lens towards Pay for Success. Our work in the area really stems in the field building and education piece of what's required in these early days. So we do things like this. We do education sessions. We run a learning hub called payforsuccess.org that has a lot of news and resources around Pay for Success if you're looking to learn more. And then we do a lot of market facilitation work, recognizing that This is a very nascent market, one that requires both flexible support and a strong learning lens. We run a few major initiatives, the California Pay for Success initiative, which links feasibility and structuring support to 7 different leaders across the state, all in various stages of project development. And also our Social Innovation Fund program around transaction structuring, which also provides flexible support to projects that have undergone some level of feasibility. So my first question was going to be to Michael, but he's not here, so I'm gonna mix it up a little bit. So when we think about the stages of development, I'm going to go to you first, Nirav, so I hope that's okay. When we think about the stages of development towards Pay for Success, we think about early exploration, we think about feasibility, we think about transaction structuring, and then we think about launch. And it's not exactly a step function. It doesn't mean you once you're done with exploration, then you move to feasibility, then you move to feasibility study, and then you check mark your way to transaction structuring. It's much more fluid than that. In a conversation I was having a few weeks ago, someone told me feasibility doesn't actually end until you close the contract and you decide on everything once that contract is closed. So when we talk about these stages of development, we recognize that it's very fluid. Oh, and right on time. So Michael, during an earlier session around feasibility, we've all gotten a good sense of what goes into some of those earlier stages of exploration. And we've talked a little bit about this overlap between feasibility and structuring a project. But once certain levels of feasibility are somewhat checkmarked or underway, can you outline some of the steps of the actual structuring process that will actually get a project to launch?
Yeah, so depending on who you've had involved in the feasibility study to date, it would include adding those that haven't been. So addressing the evaluation issue. Do you need an independent evaluator or somebody at the government going to do that? Bringing them on if they're not. Bringing it to funders, making sure, hopefully during the feasibility process, some of these things have been floated to interested parties. But once you have a more concrete idea, bringing them on in a way that is formalized. So maybe you get a commitment letter to look at the project seriously. Maybe you get sign off to go to due diligence from an investment committee. You really work to finalize those numbers. I think it's all about the contract at that point. So it becomes, you go from the world of, is this feasible? What do the feasible aspects look like? To, of those things that are feasible, what can we negotiate? And how can we resolve this in a way that all parties agree? And then I think, there's very specific items that arise through that process that all parties talk about and agree on.
So I'm going to dive a little deeper with you, Nirav. You're working on a number of different projects across the country. And for those of us not actively working on transactions, it sort of seems a little bit like a black box. Like, how do you actually get to contract close? How do you get to a project being launched? Can you tell us, in terms of maybe a recent project that you're working on, really what the process looks like and who's responsible for what? Who's leading these negotiations? What kind of things are really being negotiated during this later stage process?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the endurance and being here this afternoon. My name is Nirav Shah, as Nima mentioned, and I'm a director at Social Finance. The process, a couple things before I get into the details. One is, Nima alluded to, it's not a linear process by any means of the imagination. The process of developing a pay for success idea into a contract really looks like a spiral staircase. It's iterative. And there are a couple different paths you can take, but we have over time breaking down kind of the execution or development process into what I like to think about levels, that you need to answer a certain number of questions before you can move to a next level. So I'm going to try to break that down for you, for everyone in a little bit. The first level I really think about, there are a couple critical components. One is what's the project design? And by project design, I mean what's the target population we're looking to serve? What is the geography in which where we're going to serve that target population? And what type of size are we trying to get to that project? I think we need to land on that question. Second, if an intervention is known, I'm going to assume that, then the question is, what are the outcomes that we want to tie to the Pay for Success contract that will make contingent payments on if levels of outcomes are achieved? Third is, what is the evaluation design that we want to move the project forward? Are we looking at a randomized control trial? Are we looking at some quasi-experimental study or some other study? Those are three kind of core areas that I think are important to level one, and a lot of that is led by kind of our organization is an intermediary, and so we try to develop a process that's asking these questions of the stakeholders at the table to get to answers. A lot of it needs data to drive that process. So if we're looking at the target population, the geography, a lot of times we talk about high risk. Well, what does high risk mean? We go back, we actually detail what high risk means. We try to find data and say, well, if these are the definitions of higher risk, then where does this high risk population live in the geography in question? And so then we've isolated some geographies. And the question is, well, do we have scale to get to that geography? And if we do, how many people can we realistically serve? And this is why the evaluation design is really important. If you're going to do a randomized control trial, that might affect the ability of how many people you can serve, because now you have to have individuals that go to the control group. And so that's why evaluation design is grouped into that level one decision. So once you kind of land on level one, you move into level two. And what I think about level two is two main things. You start building out what I would call the economics of the project. What is the savings methodology or the value methodology for the outcome metrics that are in question? What are the financial benefits associated with those outcome metrics, as well as what I would call social value associated with those outcome metrics, and what's the payer willing to pay for? At the same time, once you have a sense of geography, target population, people you're serving, and evaluation, you can start building out a Pay for Success project budget, right? And those two need to converge. The savings methodology and the project budget has to converge in the sense that the savings methodology has to pay for the project budget and account for some level of returns if outcomes are achieved. And so that's kind of level two, and that's where a lot of the negotiation happens in the conversation. That is just figuring out, okay, how are we going to value this, and how are we going to dictate how the budget and those two line up. Level three is associated with a lot of what I would call financial structure. What does the payment schedule look like? When are the points of evaluation? When are the points of payment? How much payment is going to be made? What is the max level of payment for each individual payment point? And so that's a level that clearly the funders need to be at the table for level three. I would say realistically, when we talk about investors and when's the best time for them to be engaged, I think a lot of it depends on preferences of the investors and when they want to be engaged in the conversation. But a lot of times investors, well, I want something to start the conversation. And so I think of that as the foundation of Pay for Success is level one. What does the project look like? What outcomes are we looking at? What size are we looking at? What's a rough estimate of how much investment we're looking at? And that's enough to start a meaningful conversation with investors to see if they're interested in this, and if they are, what are their preferences? Because they're clearly, in the day, if you don't have government, if you don't have investors, and you don't have a provider, you don't have a deal. And so if you set up a project where you've kind of laid all the outcome metrics out, you've laid the payment schedule out, and you haven't talked to an investor, and if they don't want to invest in it, then you got to go back all the way to level one and start again, right? So it's kind of understanding who are the parties interested and working through those different levels. And I failed to mention the last level, which is level 4, which is contracting. It's codifying everything that was decisioned in the previous levels into a contract that everyone can agree upon, and then going out and raising the capital. So that's the process.
You make it sound so simple.
We can do it this afternoon.
I like your analogy of a spiral staircase, because what I'm hearing is all of these items that you're negotiating on, whether it's program design, whether it's evaluation design, whether it's the size of the project, are constantly being agreed on and iterated on up until you actually close a project.
Right, and you can see that play out, for example, as you come up with the project design and you understand the size and the geography, that has budget implications, and that budget is larger than the value that governments are willing to pay for, then you got to go back to level one and rework those aspects.
No, that's really helpful. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and Ellen, you're wearing kind of two hats today. One is as an investor with Living Cities, but in your former position, you were with the state of Massachusetts and the Department of Housing and Community Development. Excuse me. So my first question, I have a little two-part question for you. We've talked a little bit from the investor side of things, you know, Living Cities has been doing something somewhat unique as it relates to investing in projects and investing specifically in terms of this later stage transaction structuring type of support. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing?
Sure. Living Cities is a collaborative of 22 of the largest banks and foundations in the U.S., and the mission is to get dramatically better results for low-income people faster. So it's predicated on the assumption that status quo is not moving the dial on some of the biggest issues that we're facing: poverty, racial disparities. In fact, in some cases, the dial might be moving in the wrong direction. And so if we're really going to address those issues at a scale that can sufficiently address them, we're going to have to pull together resources, we're going to have to pull together people, and really have government work differently in order to get to address the problem. And so when we looked at Pay for Success, we saw that the results piece, dramatically better results, is played out in the outcomes. The focus on outcomes knows that we're getting dramatically better results, or it will tell us if we are getting those. And then the faster piece of our mission to get dramatically better results faster is really about scale. And so to think that we've been talking about Pay for Success for 5 years, there's been a ton of work that has gone into these projects, and we have 8 that have closed, which is an incredible feat, but it's only 8. And so when we look out over the next couple of years and see 40 or so in development, the question is, how do you get to scale? How do you really scale that market? And so our background is in affordable housing. We looked at the affordable housing market, the LIHTC market that most of you probably know very well, and said, you know, how did that market really scale? And it scaled essentially with the pre-development loans, that when developers had the ability to take down land, to do engineering analysis, to kind of set the projects up that they could go in and apply for tax credits, that's when we really had a fully market-driven tool. And so that was our thinking behind putting together project construction loans. This is our first time doing this. We've done 3 of them. They're all to special purpose vehicles. Third sector is the intermediary on all of these projects, but the loan goes directly to the special purpose vehicle. And the idea is that in order to really to not rely on grants to fund all of what Nirav just talked about, which is a ton of work. And if we rely on grants to fund all of that, especially facing a social innovation fund that may or may not get funded, and we have no promise of those grants coming through, we really have to get to a market tool and a market answer. And so making loans for those project construction costs, having those loans get paid off when the transaction closes by the investors, does potentially get to scaling the market. So we're really excited. It's very new. Again, the loans are very risky, but we think it does have a lot of promise to bring more of the market forces into this field.
Thank you, Ellen. You know, what I hear is there's a couple of ways that these projects are coming together from a resources perspective. There's pre-development loans, there's grants like SIF and other forms of philanthropic support. Of course, there's always bootstrapping and sweat equity that all of the teams that have been working on the sort of 8 projects to date have put a lot into, and how to streamline that is, I think, one of the questions for the future. I'm going to ask you one other question from the government perspective, putting on your other hat, if you will. For a government agency or a government budget office that has undergone, they've been involved in some level of feasibility, whatever that looks like, what does it mean to take it to the next level and really get into transaction structuring? What do governments really need to be ready for to take that next step and dive deeper?
So my initial answer is to say that they should be ready for the deal to fail like 4 times over. And I think it's maybe a slip down some of these stairs, but I worked on the Massachusetts homeless project, and I truly think that our deal died 4 different times before it somehow was resurrected and actually closed. So just an encouragement to anyone that is working on these. There are any number of reasons that these projects feel like they're going to die, and then you bring them back around and they ultimately get closed. But I think the first is, again, around kind of the data and making sure that you have a compelling answer when someone says, is this really what we're willing to pay for? The next is the political risk. And that's kind of a tough thing to really manage, but you're making appropriations that are, with future money, and at any point in the stage, someone that's politically involved is going to try to kill that project, and so I think being able to have a government champion that's really committed to the success of the program and the project, not only in this structuring kind of what can we do, how can we step up, how can we leverage more of our resources, but then is willing to really champion the deal through its entirety is critical, because there are so many different places that you have to adjust and adapt and really kind of bring something else to the table or another person to the table, and having a government champion that will really see the deal through to close is key. So be prepared to be that government champion and to have a couple lives ready in waiting when you feel like the deal might close.
Thank you. So we've started to talk about what some of the, I would call, sticky points are starting to look like when it comes to getting to this later stage transaction structuring to get to launch. I heard a little bit about political risk. I heard a little bit about the data piece and diving deeper and getting that data that's really required to get to contract close. What are a couple of these sticky points that seem to come up in your experiences closing projects or investing in projects or pulling together later stage projects from your perspective? And this is for really anybody.
I've got a good one. In my work on the project construction in upstate New York, we heard a few months into project construction that, and this is a project focus on juvenile justice, that the governor was going to pursue legislation to raise the age of criminality from 16 to 18. That could be great for our project. There's a whole bunch more folks now that are out of the adult system and into the youth system. But we also heard, again, we were hearing these things, so nothing confirmed. We also heard that he wanted to attach a significant amount of money to that bill to provide services to those youth, that not only the new youth that would be in the juvenile justice system, but also youth that exist there now. But we didn't hear that he was going to attach any sort of evaluation to it. So we held our breath. We didn't know what was going to happen to our project. Neither did the folks at the State Department, the department in the state that we were working with. Unfortunately, for those kids, the governor wasn't able to pass the bill. But it looks like our project will still be able to help some of those kids that are still now in the juvenile justice system. So in terms of sticking points, definitely policies that may affect the people that you're working with, not just during project construction or feasibility, but during the life of the project. If you're evaluating this and it goes from evaluating something and comparing it to not having that, to evaluating it against something that's very similar, you're not going to see an effect. So that's definitely a sticking point.
Anyone else?
Yeah, where do I start here? I think two to highlight. One is we touched on a little bit is valuing outcome payments, especially as we start to diversify the type of programming and interventions that can fit with Pay for Success, which from my standpoint is where we want to go with the Pay for Success field, is that you're going to get less and less tangible, cashable fiscal savings that accrue to the government, right? And so we're trying to change the narrative to think about value and value. A part of value is budget and fiscal savings, but it's beyond that. And one of the examples I like using is infant mortality. That is clearly an area where governments are spending money to reduce infant mortality rates. It does not accrue to any budget line item, but it's a policy priority. So I like thinking about value in the sense of, are we spending money on policy priorities where we're just not getting effective outcomes? And that's money ill spent. And so if you can improve the ratio of dollars spent to outcomes achieved, that's a benefit that necessarily doesn't have to accrue to budget line items. So I think that has been a sticking point in conversations, kind of midway through the development process, which is always fun. A second sticking point that's often not talked about because it's a difficult conversation, not a fun conversation, but a reality of what we're trying to do with capital, and that's termination rights. If projects are not going well halfway, 3/4 of the way through the project, commercial capital investors are going to want to say, well, I don't want to put my dollars towards a project that's not working. And so what are termination rights that you have to build into these contracts? And so what we try to do is make sure that there are opportunities to build in termination contracts, but we provide safety nets for the people that are being served. So a lot of times we have what we call wind down, termination and wind down, where we're ensuring that if a project is terminated, that we have enough funding in the pipeline to ensure that every individual that's in the program is able to see that program through to its full duration. But these are difficult conversations that I think are just hard, and people don't want to have them, so we kind of kick the can a little bit. But in the end of the day, you're not going to get a contract signed unless you figure out what these termination rights are. So I think that's another sticking point that I would identify.
Thank you. I heard, I can't remember who said it, but someone said to me, to your first point, it's called pay for success, not pay for savings. And this notion of what do we value as a society, as a government payer, and really changing that narrative to value vis-a-vis savings, which can be, quite frankly, difficult to capture in a really easily quantifiable way, is something that I think has been a topic of conversation and continues to be one, and quite frankly, in the contracting process, really forces that conversation in a really serious way. I want to ask a question on your last point, Nirav, about termination rights, not specifically about termination rights, but really more about governance of these types of projects after they get launched. So what does that really, what has that looked like in the projects that we've seen? Who holds these rights? Is it a group? Is it how much does the investor have to say about it? Tell me a little bit about what governance looks like in the projects that you all have been involved with. Anyone can answer that one.
I'll start. I think it's a good point because, again, my notion of having a government champion that's willing to stay at the table and having a whole set of partners that is willing to stay at the table as well, investors and providers. I'll give you an example. In the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Project, we closed, we finally made it, and we started having referrals. And before the project closed, Roca, who's an incredible service provider, is really known for their relentless outreach. They know every teenager there is to know in the neighborhoods that they serve. And so we just sort of assumed the referral process was going to work seamlessly. But instead of the relentless outreach that they had always done, we had the referrals coming from the state. And about 3 or 4, I don't know, Michael could tell you, but not too far into the project, we weren't getting the referrals that we needed in order to actually get enrollment. And rather than this coming out kind of later in a grant report, a year later, we didn't get the referrals, the program didn't work, blah, 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 Roca raised her hand and said, we're not getting the referrals. We have to change our system, or we have to modify the process that we have in place. And so we did. Investors, third sector, everybody was at the table to say, okay, how can we increase referrals? And we got them back on track. And that's a perfect example of kind of ongoing governance of how these projects are going to have to evolve, adapt, be modified. The evaluation might need to look differently, but to build in enough flexibility at the onset so that you can make those changes when, and they will come up, when they come up.
I just second that. I think the governance structure is look slightly differently in all the different 8 transactions that are active to date, but the concept is the same, is that we're talking about projects that are 4 to 7 years, and a lot can change in 3 to 4 years. And so we're not going to be able to predict with precision everything that's going to happen over that timeline that might affect the project. And so you need some sort of body that can come together and discuss issues that have come up and figure out ways to resolve them that speak to the integrity of what we're trying to do with the projects. And so I think they're a critical part of Pay for Success.
I'm going to ask one last question, then open it up to the crowd. I think we have this unique opportunity now that we've had some number of projects launched to really implement the learnings into the 50 or so projects that are underway across the country, including here in Virginia. And I heard a little bit about referrals from Massachusetts. What are some of those learnings that we're hearing or living in some of these active projects that we as Pay for Success stakeholders looking towards other projects should be working into the future?
I think one of them that third sector has learned from our project in Cuyahoga County is not to limit yourself to what is normally being done. So this is a project that's treating homeless mothers and reuniting them with their children who are in foster care. We built a project, we ran a ramp up or a soft start. In any case, it was some services before we actually turned the project on and started measuring outcomes to work out the kinks. And we found out that there were homeless dads with kids in foster care. We just didn't even look at that data originally. We had just assumed that it wasn't there. If we had been a little bit more creative, we would have realized that there was a population there that could have been served and could have been helped. The services look somewhat similar to the population that we were serving, so we learned we should include them. So I guess the startup actually helped us include them in the group, but it would have been nice to have done that analysis beforehand. So being a little creative with thinking about the service that you want to deliver.
So one of the things I heard is that operationalizing and ramp-up period being incredibly critical to program design in the future. Ellen, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I'm not the expert on this, so I probably shouldn't be talking about it, but just in what I've read about the Rikers Island, I think, anytime a project, quote unquote, fails or doesn't achieve the outcomes that the project was hoping for, there's a huge opportunity to learn and to figure out how to improve on that program. What we cannot do is to say, okay, the project didn't work out, SIB worked like it should, the government didn't pay, and then stop, because those kids cannot afford to continue to recidivate at the rate they are. So we cannot stop at the learning. We have to figure out how we can improve and then try something else. And so I would say, as it relates to Rikers, there is a question of when you're implementing a program in a particular setting, in an institutional setting, when you don't necessarily control who is in or not in that project. And so you think about implementing a program at a school when possibly half of the population may or may not be there at the end of the year that started there. And so I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of the context that we're trying to implement these programs in and how many of those variables we can control or can't control. Schools is a huge one that people move, especially low-income and extremely vulnerable populations. They don't tend to have long stints at a school over 5 years, maybe not even over one school year. And so we really have to be thoughtful about how we're implementing a program, what factors we can control, and how we sort of mitigate the things that we can't really solve for.
The point I'd like to point out is what you mentioned, Nima, is that you can't underestimate the operational planning and the operational complexity that goes into this. I point to our project in New York State with the Center for Employment Opportunities, where we had 2 different agencies, Department of Justice, Department of Labor, working together, and they didn't work together a lot. And so sharing data between those 2 agencies was we had to create infrastructure to do that. And the state did a phenomenal job of doing that, but it took a lot of operational planning considerations. We had extensive maps of data flows. And it didn't stop there, because then that data needed to connect up with the evaluator. It also needed to have referrals going from the Department of Justice to the individual prisons out to the Center for Employment Opportunities. So I think a key learning for us is that do not underestimate operational planning. Do not put off operational planning to the extent that's feasible and funding allows for it. Have pilot periods that can help you figure out how these systems are going to integrate in a kind of a safe period before you hit the go live button. Because inevitably, when we're talking about going to scale in operations, you're going to come across challenges. To the extent that we can hit these and find those challenges early is going to be helpful for not only the project, but most importantly, the patient population that's being served.
I think it used to be that we would, the premise was we're scaling proven programs, but that still does, even for programs that are proven and you're scaling them vis-a-vis more innovative programs, that implementation piece, that operationalizing both the government side as well as the provider side, incredibly important. Well, thank you for that. I'm gonna open it up to questions if people, I think this is the mic.
I'm going to put one more plug in for the education piece, and it's really for NFF, who's done a great job of this, but we have got to open source what we're learning.
Yeah.
That's a big premise of Living Cities, is that we open source social change, but to the extent that we're learning and that we have information, we have to figure out how we can share that more broadly, so that all of us are not having the same hurdles and addressing the same issues. NFF has done a great job of that. I really applaud, all of the field is very collaborative, but I think we still have to continue to share and share widely what we're learning.
Yeah, I agree that I'm trying to do an open source project too. So I'm going to ask a question. First, I'm going to explain why I'm asking it. I'm producing a web app. It's a game-like web app that it's called Earth Symbiosis: The Ethical Consumption Game. It makes ethical consumption easy and fun by helping you measure, track, compare, and reward your sustainable consumption of food and other products. And this is the question I need to ask. You spoke a lot about how to do things. Is there anybody who would help me that you know of that could help me make a deal specifically like this with governments and insurance agencies to reduce water scarcity and carbon emissions, and just people I can talk to?
I don't know of anything in particular. I mean, I think having a government partner is key, and you want to make sure that there's a government who is willing to pay, because that's ultimately kind of how these projects are funded. So I would make sure that the project is somewhat government-led, so that there's enough of a stake in the ground that the project can actually get funded.
And I would suggest, I'm not sure how far along in development this app is, but rolling it out, understanding how effective it is, and then bringing those results to some government or some group of folks that would like to do a feasibility on whether or not you could roll it out to a government or an insurance agency or something like that. I'm not sure if you're a student here or not, but maybe if you did something to have some users here, you might be able to test the results of that app.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Quiet afternoon. Is this the time we start tap dancing?
Friday afternoon.
I have one other question, and I think we've talked a lot about the 8 projects, the pace of activity, recognizing that's both, and this is a question I think I hear at like every Pay for Success conference I've ever been to. But how do we continue to pursue high quality projects, but hopefully accelerate the pace of moving towards high quality projects? What level of standardization is required, knowing that at this point, 8 projects, you look at one project, it's one project. How do we get there?
I can start. I think there's a risk of standardizing too early, and I don't know if we're at that point where we can standardize, because a lot of these projects are bespoke, but they're bespoke for a reason, because you're still different. You're dealing with different issue areas and different types of programs and different types of geographies where the facts and circumstances are really important and they can't be ignored in the moment. I think the area where we can standardize and gain efficiencies and streamlining is really nailing down what that process looks like and trying to pin stakeholders down to that process. And I think the development loans helps with that, because you have a little bit of a ticking time bomb, right? That helps figure out, okay, this is the process we need to go about. This is the funding we have, and after X date where we don't have any more funding to deal with, to move forward and continue to plug in resources to develop this contract. And I think that's the area where we can start standardize to without losing any of the quality side.
All right, so we've got people here from across different industries and different interests and so forth, but what are 2 or 3 action items that folks here can take to keep the momentum going from this conference? If they want to get a pay for success feasibility study going, what are 2 or 3 steps that they could take to really get that ball rolling?
I'll start. I would say engaging the municipality or the government that you want to work with. So making sure that you bring them to the table, that they are a committed sort of champion of the project. And then 2, building the evidence base for it. I think that there is a ton of data that we have, some of which is useful. And so the more that we can build more useful data and test it and invest in the systems necessary to track the outcomes, the better we will all be.
I can piggyback on that. In addition to building evidence base, I also think we need to build organizational capacity. The goal, or part of the goal with Pay for Success, is moving the needle on some of these intractable or seemingly intractable problems. And in order to do that, you're going to need organizations that can take in large sums of money and deploy that effectively. And that takes investment at the organizational level, which I know for nonprofits is hard to get that type of funding. And so I think that's another area of focus that can help kind of think about building an ecosystem of which impact investment dollars can invest in.
Ellen, you spoke a little bit about having a government champion. Can you speak a little bit to your experience about actually, you don't have to say who you had as your champion, but just going through that process and just really trying to gain their support?
Sure. So on the projects that we sort of started out in Massachusetts, I was part of the project administration, but we had the juvenile justice and the homeless one, and we actually had a Harvard SIBLab fellow who was actually in the administration and finance that really sort of championed a lot of the feasibility stuff, and that was huge. It takes so much relational kind of capacity to build these projects, and so having somebody that's actually sitting in the local government, in the state government, wherever the deal is being kind of developed in the government, it's incredible to have someone that's sort of there that can make the connections, that can get the data sources, that can match it, because a lot of that stuff is private, and so you have to physically be there to be able to do that. The other thing is to have that person stay on. And so in Massachusetts, they actually kind of made a permanent position for the SIBLab fellow that's doing social innovation, I think is her title. But to have someone that's actually committed to that, because as in the case in Massachusetts, the governor changes, or the head of ANF changes, or the head of DOE changes, and so to be able to have someone that has enough agency that they've got enough power, but is not maybe subject to political terms, is extremely beneficial.
Yeah, and I think Ellen spoke to this, but I'm going to elaborate a little bit. I think there's two types of champions you need. I think you need one political champion to initiate and be a catalyst to a process, right? Whether it be an RFP or somehow saying, I want to get this government to engage and pay for success. I think you also need a career champion because the politician is not going to be behind the scenes writing out the contract or negotiating all these different aspects. And that's where you need a career champion to help break down barriers, whether it's data access or connecting different agencies together or just thinking about what are the right trade-offs and where are we willing to make those trade-offs. And I think that's equally as important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've heard people call that the doer, sort of the political champion and then the doer. And what I've seen across the projects we've supported and worked with at NFF is those doers can be in different places. They can be in the budget office. They could be a head of an agency. They could maybe be, a SIB-Lab fellow who adds some added capacity. That has really varied, actually, as it relates to the different projects that we've come across. But having that bootstrapping, we've seen it be a legal team as in other counties. So that I think that doer piece is really important. Was there someone else? Sorry.
Great panel. Thank you, guys. Two questions. One, a lot of the discussion today has been, I would say, a little bit weighted towards government as well as social sector. And when we've talked about the investment community, not talking about the philanthropic investment community, but the actual for-profit side, banks, it's often kind of more passive. Is there a way to change the dynamic where the for-profit investment community could have more agency here, more ownership, and how would you do that? And then the second question for each of you is to complete the sentence, I wish that.
I'll start with the first one. I have to think about that. I wish that. I actually think for-profit investors have a lot of agency in the projects, especially if that funding is needed to execute a contract, right? Whether it comes to what are the outcome selections, what are the terms of the payments, what are the termination rights. That voice is certainly part of the conversations and the negotiations. And if they're not part of the voice, you're not going to get their investment. I think in looking out in a couple of years, you definitely want to have the participation or grow the participation of kind of the for-profit investment sector in this, because I think one of the benefits of Pay for Success is thinking about how do you grow the pie of dollars that flow into the social services sector, and certainly that's where there's just a tremendous amount of potential. But the investor here might have thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the senior side, we have 10 banks that are part of our membership. A lot of them sort of dip their toe into Pay for Success through our loan because they invested in us and then we invested in the projects. I think that there is a lot of interest, but in some ways it's almost been sort of I don't know, someone could verify this, but like a political that once Goldman starts leading these projects, then everyone gets really scared because they're sort of the big gorilla that you're maybe afraid of what their incentives are. And I'm not saying anything against Goldman. I think they've been a phenomenal partner. And so maybe that's been some of the hesitation. But I think there's also sort of a huge part when you're putting together the deal terms, like Nirav said, of how long you're willing to wait to have your money repaid. And that one kind of decision can have incredible implications for how long you can measure outcomes. I will say that at Living Cities, we are willing to have our money out for longer if it means that we'll actually be able to measure the outcome that we want to see. So teen pregnancy, for example. Do you want to measure teen pregnancies averted over a year or over 5 years? You don't know if they're delayed or maybe averted if you're only measuring for a year. So to be willing to have your money out for 5 years means that you can track that teenager from 9th grade until she or he finishes and to see if their involvement in a pregnancy, for 5 years. And so I think those are kind of the questions that actually have huge program implications, but they're led by the investor because it's their capital that either needs to get returned in year 1, year 2, year 3, but they do have a lot of influence. Maybe it's just more kind of in the behind the scenes, putting together the actual contract.
And I think the optical piece of this is public policy goals must be first and foremost in these projects, and achieving outcomes must be. So there sometimes can be this tension of what does the involvement of the private sector really mean for public policy goals, and should it influence it? And I think that's not necessarily the case from the private investors that we've seen in this project. They've been great partners, but there is a little bit of that optics that we can't necessarily deny, and we have to be conscious of as those who are stewards of high quality, impactful projects.
And I think there's also something structural right now that prevents some of the commercial lenders from doing this. It takes a long time for one of these projects to go through feasibility, construction, and then launch. It's a significant amount of resources for a transaction coordinator, as you know, Nirav, to do one of these things. If a commercial bank were to engage in this, they would have to play that role, right? They would have to have a team of folks that are looking for projects and actively structuring them to some point where they either walk away or continue to do it until it comes to fruition. The way that a lot of commercial banks think about these things is like venture capital. You're investing in a management team to deliver some sort of outcome. In some traditional venture capital, you're looking at return. In these, you are as well, but it's in the form of an outcome that a government's willing to pay for. So there could be in the future, if these things become more quickly developed, some sort of VC type activity that commercial lenders or some funds engage in, where they go actively look for nonprofits and say, I think you would be great to achieve a lot of outcomes, and I could potentially fund you for X amount of years and have some access to the rewards that the government would provide for providing those outcomes. But I think we're a long way off from that.
I have a wish. I wish that the federal government, or most likely the federal government, would pass an outcomes fund or create an outcomes-based fund that would be a catalyst for states and local jurisdictions to move forward with Pay for Success. I think the outcomes fund would also help some of the wrong pocket problems that are holding back interventions, for example, in the healthcare space. I think that in the UK they have an outcomes fund through Big Society Capital, and it's been a boon to their ability to put together Pay for Success projects.
I'm going to go back to the data piece. I wish we had better data, and we had open data and ways to match it and to share it, and the resources to collect it. I think that there's just a huge piece around data that's really going to constrain this field unless we address it. So that would be my wish.
Dang, that was mine.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, I would wish that I woke up tomorrow and each state and local government in the United States had somebody working on figuring out how to do a Pay for Success project. Since that's not going to happen, I would love to see some sort of funding to do that kind of thing more broadly across the United States.
And I'm going to take a slightly different tact. I think it'll be very holistic between the four of us. I wish that the provider community and the capacities required to bridge the gap from promising to proven providers, there was support for that to really build that capacity of the service provider community, because I think they're where the outcomes happen on the ground. Feels like that's a good ending, but I don't know if there's one question. Go ahead. I feel like that was such a good ending.
So we talk about the ecosystems, and how we're talking about trying to change an ecosystem that's been in place for a lot of years. And that's not an easy task by any means, whether you're looking at it from a government side, nonprofit side, private sector side, banking side. But when you talk about, I was talking to Josh about social entrepreneurialism. That's a relatively new term, but it's just now when you scale it and you start talking about B Corps or benefit corporations, and now a couple of them going IPO, and you start looking at how do you guys see benefit corporations or B Corps or that scalable social enterprise mentality changing the ecosystem or affecting the ecosystem?
I don't know enough, but I think it's a good directional. The fact that we're thinking about legal structures that allows for different types of financing to come in to allow for that double bottom line, triple bottom line is a benefit, and I think it's part of this movement to thinking about how to use capital to do social good. I'm not a lawyer and don't know enough about the specifics to kind of have specific comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's refreshing to see a different model that's out there for how you might be able to scale impact. And I think having for-profit companies that you can make equity investments into, you have a lot more potential to get to scale than the grant dollars that we've been trying to cobble together to do what we've done in the past. So to the extent that, you know, it taps into a whole bigger, much bigger market of capital, I think it has a lot of promise, and we'll just have to see kind of where it goes. But there's a lot of really interesting people out there that have, you know, incredible ideas, and a lot of angel investors that seem willing to try them and to test them. So we'll see, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to close by saying I think the means to the end, whether it's a B Corp, whether it's a for-profit, whether it's a nonprofit, this is all about a means to an end of achieving better results for our communities. So it almost, whatever the means is, whatever the best means is, it's most important that we get to the end. Similar to the topic of pay for success, we know that this is hard work, and we know that this is transforming ecosystems is hard work, but it's always really important to remember why we're actually all here sticking through to the end of the day to learn about this work. So thank you for having us.
All right, I'm just going to do it from down here. We just want to thank you all for staying with us to the very end and giving us a great deal more insight on how to structure these. A couple notes, all of the slides will be available. We'll send a follow-up email with those and some other resources if you want to move forward on this. Thank you for all staying to the end, and we hope that you'll join us over at the Tom Tom Festival. We'll have a reception tent over there, and we look forward to talking with you more. Thank you all.
I have no business talking about this, but I was like, well, I feel like Eileen has talked about that enough. That